Configuration Manager Console overview. Alright, in our last nugget, we actually installed System Center Configuration Manager. And now I want to just give you kind of the rundown of the Configuration Manager console. What you'll see here, first of all, is that it doesn't appear in Start anywhere, as with many other things that we have in this new, Start tile, Start window, whatever you want to call it, kind of a UI that Microsoft has blessed us with these days. It is a little bit harder to find. Here it is, however, though. If you keep scrolling over after looking at all the apps, you'll see this Configuration Manager console. Now what I'm going to do is, and I'll just drag this up because it's out of the recording area, but what I'm going to do is just pin this to my taskbar, and if you work with Configuration Manager a lot, that's probably a good idea. All right, set our things back up here, and there we go. So let's just kind of get a quick rundown of what these various items are that we see here. We're not going to spend a lot of time. This will be a short nugget. And if you're already pretty well familiar with Configuration Manager, you might not need to watch this. But here under Assets and Compliance, it's kind of exactly what it says. Now, first of all, I guess I should explain a couple things here. This over here on the left is called the navigation pane, and it's context sensitive to what you've selected down here under the workspaces. Okay, these are all workspaces. So notice that we're in Assets and Compliance, and we see these items. If I switch to, for example, Administration, then we get different items. Okay, so it's all context sensitive. To me, it would have been more intuitive if Microsoft would have put these things at the top and these things underneath them. But that's just how Microsoft did it. So anyway, what we also have here is a ribbon up here at the top. This is also context sensitive, and depending upon what item you've selected here in the navigation or assets, or rather in the workspaces, then you're going to see different things there. Also, you'll see results pane over here in the middle, and sometimes you'll see a preview pane down here closer to the bottom. Again, not all items will show all those items, but you'll see that very often. So here we are back in Assets and Compliance. Now what do we have with this? What we want to identify is the users that we have. Right now I don't see any. The devices that we have. I might see a couple in here, a few. We could see more. Here's what I was telling you earlier. You might see a preview pane down at the bottom. You can resize this. This will give me more detail about that machine. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is there's a lot of different things that are not mentioned here. It's all blank, right? The client check detail. Notice there's also tabs down here. There's nothing found there. There's no policies really found. There's no client settings because there's default settings and default anti-malware. But anyway, there's not really a lot of detail, and that's because we do not yet have the Configuration Manager client installed on any computer. Once you install the client, which is coming up in an upcoming nugget, so look at the titles for that one, then it will start to report back specific excruciating detail about everything about that computer, okay, about that device. Anyway, so here's the devices. There can be users here. We don't have any users yet, but there's a lot of different ways to scan for those users. There's user state migration, which we're not really using here quite yet anyway. And this would be very useful if, for example, we wanted to migrate everybody's Windows 7 settings to Windows 8.1 or to Windows 10 or whatever. Asset intelligence, if you expand this out, you see some inventoried software, for example. That can be very useful so that we can identify if we're complying with licensing, for example. Software metering might be useful to identify how much specific software is used, compliance settings, all different kinds of things here as well. You can set up configuration baselines and see how far adrift systems go from those baselines, for example. We're not going to explain all these in excruciating detail. I just want to show you what's available here. Really, this whole assets and compliance thing here, particularly for users and the computers, for example, that's going to get the starting point for things to work with. I mean, after all, Configuration Manager doesn't do anything unless it has user accounts or, more likely, even devices that it can work with, so that it can deploy software, so that it can make changes, so that it can apply updates. Then we have things such as the software library down here. As I click on that particular workspace, we see application management, so we can identify applications and packages. A lot of confusion between the two of those. We'll be discussing that when we talk more about software deployment later on. You can have software that users want to have, but that you have to approve, and once you've approved it, then it can install itself. We have App V capability here, Windows side loading, which is useful for Windows 8 and later, because remember, with the Windows Store, they use different kinds of applications now, and you can install applications that are not part of that store, but which still comply with the general idea of how that's used. And in order to do that, you have to use keys. There's also software updates that will work in conjunction with WSUS, which again will address all of these things, including operating system deployments at a later point in time. And then there's monitoring. This might be very useful, for example, if you're deploying software. Maybe you're going to roll out some version of Office to an entire department, and you want to see how many clients have received it, how long it's taking the clients to receive it, things like this. You can get all this kind of information as well as alerts for something that may have failed, for example. Again, a lot of detail there, which we won't fully explore right now. And then finally here, we have administration. Now, this is one of the places where you have to make initial configurations. For example, under hierarchy configuration, we need to establish boundaries and discovery methods. We're going to be discussing those here as well. I think I'll just save that for the next nugget because, again, this one's going to be very short. I'm just going to kind of give you the rundown of all of these things. But what this will do is going to identify boundaries, for example. Let me go back to that. Boundaries here, where once I start to create these, it will give the clients identified site servers that they can identify with. So, for example, they can only be identified with primaries. And once they're identified with a primary, and once they've been discovered, which we can also come up with methods for doing that, and you can see some default ones right here, then we can start to work with them. Once they've been discovered, then we would go to this workspace, assets and compliance, and we would start to see those devices. We would start to see those users and so forth. But returning back here to administration, you can also see that we can work with cloud services like Intune. So if you have devices, for example, that are not part of a domain, then you can use Windows Intune to manage those items. And you can even use Windows Intune, for example, under these cloud services to create distribution points. There's also site configuration where you can identify which sites you have. This can go along with the configured Active Directory site, which as you can see here, what I've got. And then any client settings that you want to configure. These are the default client settings. When we say client, we don't mean a client in a generic term as in a Windows desktop client or a Windows server client, that kind of thing. This relates to the client software that you deploy on those machines. And again, we'll talk more about that as we deploy that software at a future point. You can configure the security that you have here. This is going to be useful for specifying different individual administrators for specific kinds of administration. And that's very useful because you don't want all administrators to have full privileges usually. Okay, so those are some of the items that we have down through here. You can use certificates for a number of different things as well. And then you can also look at the migration item here. This is going to be very useful, again, if you have to migrate from Windows 7 to Windows 10 or something like that. All right, well, that's pretty much the rundown for the Configuration Manager console that we have here. Remember, you can also install this console on a Windows desktop computer, such as your own workstation like Windows 8 or Windows 10 workstation, so that you can remotely control any Configuration Manager installations. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.